And here's some more wild fun in Crimea, as always. The Crimean bridge was closed for the entire night. In Sevastopol, there were massive explosions near the Saki and Belbek airfields. By the way, things are absolutely insane in Crimea right now. The thing is, the few remaining fans of the Russian world who are still on the temporarily occupied peninsula, there aren't many of them, of course. Even they are in shock, because these Russian liberators are creating absolute horror and chaos on the peninsula, just like they did in Donbass.
Did we really vote for Russia? Just so that Russia would leave us without any means to survive? Why is the administration setting up our Russia with its actions, making people upset now? Ukraine gave us jobs, but under Russia we've been left without work. The actions they're taking, they're discrediting Russia itself. That's the issue. So it turns out 300 people are left in their old age, some in their old age. Well, just look, there aren't any 20-year-olds or 25-year-olds here. Everyone is between 40 and 60 years old. Where are we supposed to go? Who will hire us at this age?
But you know, I want to say that Crimeans still have little to complain about. Just look at what's happening in Russia itself, the most spiritual Russia.
This is a lesson in an ordinary school in Murmansk. There's no electricity, and the children are forced to study by flashlight.
We did not receive any of them.
We're studying by the soft, dim light of a candle.
Do you think people are sitting without power and water in the harsh Russian winter because of Ukrainian armed forces' drones? No, all this is happening because their president is Putin. It's that simple.
People found themselves on the brink of survival because 5 power line pylons collapsed 7 kilometers from Murmansk. A major accident happened due to improper maintenance.
To put it simply, Putin couldn't care less about what happens in the Russian hinterland. For him, the main thing is to liberate Ukraine from some imaginary Nazis, right?
This state of utilities management has been around since Soviet times. Wear and tear is at 60, 70, even 80%. In big cities, it's a bit less because money is allocated and invested there. Moscow is a separate region. It gets more funding.
Well, of course, more funds go to Moscow. After all, that's where the Kremlin is, that's where Putin sits, and you just sit there in your Murmansk and keep quiet. That's exactly the logic in the Kremlin.
But this is far from an isolated incident. For example, in December, there were already several accidents on the heating networks in the Altai region. During repairs, more than 500 apartment buildings were left without heating. The main cause of the emergency is the severe wear and tear of the heating networks. During these days, the air temperature dropped to minus 28 degrees.
By the way, the funny thing is that even in Putin's hometown, St. Petersburg, there's a collapse too.
In St. Petersburg, electricity went out at night in the Krasnogvardeyski district, and in the Krasnoselsky district, more than 20 buildings were left without heating due to an accident on a worn-out heating network. Some residents also lost hot water while it was below freezing outside.
But the most important part is coming up right now. Russians who are watching me, listen to this and draw your own conclusions about whom you chose as president.
To avoid such accidents in the housing and utilities sector, about 10 trillion rubles need to be invested in Russian infrastructure. That is exactly how much the Kremlin spent on financing the war in Ukraine in 2025.
Yeah, Putin's Russia is a real Mordor, and the worst for the swamps of civilization is only just beginning. That's all for today. Subscribe to the Nazi Bit Ukraine YouTube channel. Take care.
The Russians who came to rebuild Crimea after World War II turned out to be completely helpless in the face of the problems that befell them. The devastation on the peninsula was especially severe. The population had been cut in half. To restore life in Crimea, thousands of citizens from other regions of the USSR, mostly from Russia, were sent to the peninsula. They are lured here with promises of resort-like conditions, a warm climate and the sea. And wine. The reality turns out to be somewhat different. The colonists are settled in the abandoned huts of the deported Tatars with no warning about the arid climate. It turns out that in such conditions it is impossible to grow the grain crops familiar to northerners. The shortage of water was felt especially acutely since rain is rare in Crimea and there are practically no full-flowing rivers. The Crimean Tatars had solved this problem, skillfully building wells. The colonists from Russia, however, had no experience in obtaining water in these unfamiliar natural conditions, and there was no one to teach them, since all the Tatars had already been deported by that time. Sometimes, in difficult situations, they even had to ask the higher authorities to send at least one Tatar to show them how to obtain water. Instead of restoring the peninsula, the Russian settlers only managed to worsen the already dire state of Crimea. The economy, and especially agriculture, fell into a state of complete decline. Once fertile lands gradually turned into a depressed region. Information about this began to reach Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev's son-in-law, journalist Alexei Ajubey, recalled that when the first secretary learned about the situation in Crimea, he personally, without warning, soon went to Crimea to check the situation on the ground. What struck and upset Nikita Sergeyevich the most were the crowds of resettlers who, by some means, had heard about his trip. A silent grey mass of people blocked the road and also silently, without moving aside, waited for the cars to stop. The people burdened and for a long time did not start the conversation, giving Khrushchev the opportunity to speak first. Then, from the crowd, one question would be heard, then a second, a third, about food, housing, and assistance. The resettlers had mostly come from Russia, from the Volga region and the northern Russian provinces. Now I write, had come. But they shouted, "We were driven here." The familiar lament of people who have lost hope of finding a secure fate. There were even hysterical outbursts from the crowd. "Potatoes don't grow here, cabbage withers." Or suddenly something even sadder. "The bedbugs have eaten us alive." "Then why did you come?" Khrushchev would ask. And the crowd would sigh. We were deceived. After such meetings, a heavy silence would fall in the car. Malenkov and Khrushchev would avert their eyes from each other, afraid of a possible quarrel. I could feel that Khrushchev was boiling with anger and was about to snap, but he would either calm down or play it sly. He hid his anger inside. He was saving it for the future. That same evening, as the Muscovites were looking for a place to spend the night, Nikita Sergeyevich noticed a small military airfield not far from the highway and ordered the car to turn toward it. There he found an old Douglas airplane. Upon learning that the plane was still operational, Khrushchev left his entourage behind and flew to Kyiv. A few hours later, Ajubey recounts, they were already there. The capital of Ukraine greeted the distinguished guest with joyful cheers that never ceased. I remember that the door was torn off the car meant to transport the guests. Late in the evening, Kyiv's leaders gathered at the Mariinsky Palace. The dinner was lively and noisy. Toasts followed one after another. Khrushchev kept returning to his trip to Crimea and urged the Ukrainians to help revive the land. They need southerners there, people who love orchards and corn, not potatoes, he lamented. Most likely, even then during that trip, Khrushchev conceived the idea of transferring Crimea to Ukraine. Otherwise, the peninsula would have turned into a real desert. At that time, Ukraine was still the breadbasket of the Union. It was assigned the task of revitalizing the depressed region. Within a few years, tens of thousands of volunteers from the southern regions arrived on the peninsula. And just 2 years after Crimea was transferred to Ukraine, iron ore extraction on the peninsula increased by 36%, electricity production by 57%, and wine production by 104%. Gradually, livestock farming revived, and vineyards and orchards flourished. By the way, another economic reason for transferring the peninsula was the construction of the North Crimean Canal and the irrigation of the steppe regions of northern Crimea. It was easier to manage this process from Kyiv, where all the materials were supplied from. The official reason for the annexation was declared to be the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Rada, supposedly a symbol of the union between the two brotherly peoples, Ukrainians and Russians. A symbol, of course, according to Russian and Soviet historians. In reality, there was no union of so-called brotherly peoples. Ukrainians fought with Russians both before and after the Pereyaslav Rada. This is a very interesting topic, and a video about it is already being prepared by our channel's editorial team. In addition to the socio-economic aspects, there is also a theory that Crimea became a testing ground for intra-party struggles. At the time, Dmitry Shepilov, a member of the Central Committee of the CPSU, even accused Khrushchev of pandering to Ukraine in his memoirs. But almost everyone supported the idea of transferring the peninsula, except for the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, Vyacheslav Molotov. A few years later, it was Molotov who would lead the group that unsuccessfully tried to remove Khrushchev from his position as head of the USSR. But one way or another, nothing changes the fact that Crimea truly flourished with Ukraine, becoming a real jewel. Some people, especially in Russia, sometimes try to dispute this, saying that the revival of Crimea was supposedly a collective effort of the entire Soviet Union, and that Ukraine had no special role in it. Such comrades should be reminded that in the USSR, collective meant nobodies. And the attempt at an all-Union restoration of Crimea immediately after the war ended in a complete failure. And this was mainly due to the settlers who came from Russia. The very course of historical events shows that without Ukraine and Ukrainians, Crimea cannot exist. The current situation of the peninsula under Russia's incompetent control is a perfect example of this. It serves as undeniable and truly excellent evidence. And in fact, all of this is because Crimea does not need Russians. Crimea needs Ukrainians.